So in this particular panel, what we're going to be looking at and diving into is really the energy sector's situation in the Canadian electrification landscape. It is pretty much our experience that over the last several years in Canada, from west to east, the vast majority of the utility sector has not had a strategic plan. They haven't had a strategic plan for electrification. It's been a struggle to effectively move into electrification. And for those utilities that have had some kind of strategy, it's largely been motivated by the fact that the city has dictated that it ought to be so, and the transit agency has dictated that it ought to be so. And so it hasn't come from within organically at the transit agency level, or rather at the utility level. And so therefore, what we started at QTRIC several years ago was moving into a power providers working group. So for those of you who are part of our consortium, if you are a utility in our consortium, we got together a number of utilities across the country to say, just like transit agencies were struggling to share information around electrification, utilities actually were not sharing information. And in this country, we have vertically integrated utilities like BC Hydro, Manitoba Hydro, Hydro-Quebec, that can move and shake across the entire distribution scheme. And then we also have local distribution companies that are municipally backed or fully municipally backed utilities that are really obligated by the needs of the municipality. And so that creates a really difficult, complex mosaic, and it's just not possible to have a standard utility approach. There are loads of different business plans that are going to have to emerge. But first and foremost, it was important to get the utilities out to the dialogue to start with. And so with that, I'd like to welcome our speakers, and each one is going to give you a little bit of insight into what their utility or their utility strategy and the energy strategy is more globally with regards to energy systems and utility integration. So first, I'd like to welcome Sasha Pacic from Stantec. Sasha is the managing principal and lead at Stantec's Global Transit Advisory Practice, and he's very specifically focused on zero emissions bus portfolio, and I've had the great pleasure of working with Sasha on a number of projects recently. So Sasha. This one should, the big green button. Yeah, that one should work.
Very good. And good morning to everyone. So, what I'd like to talk about today is really from the transit perspective, is understanding, where's the fit? Where do we bring, electricity and transit together? So our journey to electrification starts with, recognizing that we were partners in the past. We were friends. And there's emerging approaches coming again, and that's great to see that collaboration. But then at the same time, there's challenges for both industries. Transit and power have their own divergent issues, and they need to come together. So where's the fit? And that's what we're going to talk about. So we were partners in the past, recognizing that in history, electric utilities used to run and own transit. And they were all over North America, even right here in the great city of Winnipeg with the Winnipeg Electric Company. So they were prevalent. Ontario Hydro and Ontario, the precursor to OPG and Hydro One, very active in transit. As you can note, there was a lot of local street and radial network railways run across the province, from Toronto to Guelph to Winnipeg to Hamilton. Ontario Hydro played a lead role. So, we're starting to see some interesting partnerships emerging once again. And, as the previous panel spoke, there's a lot going on in California, especially with their innovative clean technology mandate from CARB. We're seeing a lot of positive movement in the state. First we look at the California Public Utilities Commission. They've stepped in with really a leadership role on creating a transportation electrification framework. So that framework, we're obviously insular, we're looking at transit, but they're looking at electrification across all industries. So that in itself presents a whole other challenge. So looking at rate design and principles for zero emission vehicle fueling and getting the price right so people can afford it and agencies can afford it. We're seeing, some of the electricity providers in the state emerging with some really interesting approaches. For instance, Southern California Edison, SCE, they've stepped in and developed a charge-ready program. And what the charge-ready program is, if you allow them access to your land, 100% funding for electric vehicle charging infrastructure, including transit. If you don't give them easement to your land, 80%. So not a bad deal either way. You get 20 cents, it's costing you 20 cents on the dollar, in worst case, to design a charger and an infrastructure to your liking. So an interesting partnership. They're also waiving demand charges. So for those that aren't familiar with electricity jargon, demand charges are the highest price for your highest demand to account for facilities, building power generation, utility lines, etc. So what they're doing in the case of SE, they're waiving those demand charges until 2024, and then ramping them up slowly and incrementally. And an interesting development in the state is that they're guaranteeing price matching equivalent to the cost of diesel. So that sounds nice for agencies that are running diesel, but in California there's a lot of agencies running natural gas, which is a lot less price. So that presents a problem in California, which I sit on the Zero Emission Bus Task Force for the California Transit Association. We're dealing with that right now, saying, well, the cost of diesel is just not good enough because we're paying the cost of natural gas. When we look at the Pacific Gas and Energy and Electric, their strategy is an interesting one. They're developing a commercial rate as well, one that's targeting to be lower than the cost of diesel. So we're kind of in that in between, diesel and natural gas. They're also looking at subscription charges. So as opposed to having those high demand peak charges, having more of a subscription-based access to power is what's emerging in their situation. Also looking at the volume of time of use charging and how that relates. Obviously, if you're charging off peak, it's going to be less expensive than charging on peak. So there's some encouraging developments certainly in California. But electric vehicles bring challenges to both transit and power. Transit's core business is moving people at the end of the day and providing high quality service. Not to disrespect any of the transit agencies, but the staffing and the sophistication that's going to be required to manage power the way it really needs to be managed is probably beyond the capabilities of most. There's some large agencies that probably can take that in-house and do it very well, but I'm going to say that a lot of the smaller agencies, mid-size, may not have the capacity and the experience to really manage power the way it needs to be. We've gotten away from having relationships with electric utilities. I mean, transit agencies have had no reason to engage their electric utilities. But that's changing. So now we need a new partnership and a new strategy for that. I'm going to argue that electric utilities are in a better position to manage overall load. Again, we're looking at it from our perspective at the transit agency level saying, we need power and we need it now. But the regulator and the electric utility is looking at it from a broader perspective of managing entire load. So I'm going to suggest that they're better suited to manage that entire load for the whole system. And coming down to the charging infrastructure itself, again, not a core function of transit. And I think it's better left to other partners who are really experts in that field, just making sure that for transit stability, the infrastructure is ready, it's available when needed. We talked about demand charges. I heard a presentation at the American Public Transit Association a couple months ago from Denver, and they were saying 85% of their bill is only the demand charge itself. So the power cost itself, very small. And they were quite terrified that they were going to lose their jobs, frankly, when they got their first utility bill because they weren't prepared for that shock. So demand charges make up the bill. Energy storage can help, but who's in the best position to own that energy storage? Should it be at the agency side or should it be at the electricity utility side? Again, managing that overall load. That's a discussion we need to have, and we should have it today. When we look at it from the electric utility side, they have their own challenges. This mass uptake now of electric vehicles is something that needs to be managed. They need to be able to supply power to everyone, and of course, everyone's going to need the power all at the same time. So this is an issue, and it's coordinating those charging loads and power availability across all different streams, moving power to where it needs to be at that time. And of course, there's that funding question that keeps coming up. There's a lot of investment required. Who will pay for all this, and how will we pay for it? So we need a true partner, and that's what I'm advocating for on the transit side, that electricity is available and priced to sell when we need it. There's an interesting business case that presents with the electrification of transportation in that the business case to invest in renewables becomes a lot more attractive. Because we have this predictable, stable load that's going to be required all the time, it's an asset for electric utilities and local distribution companies to invest in renewables. And this new term has been coined in California with this the curve up there, love your duck curve. And what the duck curve is essentially what is your demand for power versus on the top end versus on the lower end, how much is being supplied by renewables. So that gap kind of forms a silhouette of a duck. So that's the whole point of the duck curve. It's really trying to shrink that gap and really looking at whether the investment is there. And I think the business case presents itself for utilities to invest in renewables because we can close that gap and make the duck curve less ducky. Also looking at, overnight charging and that strategy. We're going to have predictable demand. So the additional running time for more baseload generation makes sense. I think we can invest in more baseload to be able to charge vehicles, so that's all good. I'll also advocate for a price comparable to diesel in Canada. I think that's the right strategy to put agencies at the same, at the same playing field until that's figured out, and of course with no demand charges. Turnkey infrastructure, I would say, is very attractive for the transit industry. We did talk a little bit about the P3 models. I think there's going to be some more discussion during the conference on the P3 models, but they're a viable solution. I mean, simply put, the mandates, and what I'm seeing even in California, we have a mandate, but it's unfunded, so there's really no way to pay for it. So how do we shoulder this cost burden? It can't be at the municipal level. We can't afford it. So that's something that we need to close the gap on. Also looking at, one pain point we hear from agencies, in California is the coordination of construction and really putting on street chargers. They don't like going through the whole permitting process. They don't like that. So turnkey solutions, I think, are the way to go. I'll also say that I believe electric utilities are in a much better position to maintain the equipment. Again, they're electrical experts, and we're all going to be competing then for the same pool of resources too. Service level agreements will need to be developed, meaning that when the transit agency needs that infrastructure, it's got to be available and has to be down to the second, frankly. And last, looking at resiliency for power downs. I mean, this is a major problem, and we had a situation in California a few months ago where San Joaquin RTD lost power. They lost 25 of their electric buses. They had a 2-day power down. So fortunate for them, they still had their diesel buses kicking around. So they put them back into service, but not everyone's going to have that space. They're not going to be able to store dual fleets. So we really do need some resiliency solutions. Unfortunately, I'm thinking that those are going to be fossil fuel driven in the short term until something else comes up, and we look to the industry to come up with some of those solutions. So with that, I'll stop talking.
Thank you, Sasha. That was great. All right. Always a whirlwind tour. I appreciate the methodology. I sympathize. And so with that, I'm going to turn to Kim from BC Hydro. We've had a great opportunity to start working with BC Hydro a lot more in Vancouver around the TransLink project. And Kim has an illustrious history, not only as a manager at BC Hydro, but also in British Columbia within her role in energy conservation and electrification. So with that, moving over to Kim.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for having me here today. I'm going to take you through a quick overview of BC Hydro and a little bit from a utilities perspective on how we support the electrification of transportation. So a few quick facts about BC Hydro, probably the most important being that we are a Crown corporation owned by the province of British Columbia. We do serve 95% of the population. We're very fortunate to have a hydroelectric system, so our system is 97.8% clean. So we have lots of substations, transmission line, distribution lines. And one of the roles that I do at BC Hydro is really supporting the transportation sector. So we're very interested in partnering with our customers for electrification. In my role, while I'm very fortunate to work in the transit space, I also support marine, we also support airports, we also support trucking. So there's a lot of different applications that we look to for the electrification of transportation amongst mass transit. From a utility perspective, the electrification of transportation is actually quite complex. I'm sure that's no surprise to everybody. But we have poles and wires to maintain. We have to worry about capacity to support that. There's infrastructure beyond the traditional customer drops. So as you were mentioning, Sasha, about who's in a better position to maintain charging equipment, who's responsible for the interconnection cost, charging infrastructure and management. So again, we look at it from an entire grid perspective, and if everybody electrifies at once, we suddenly have a lot more to manage than we did before. And there's, of course, different end uses that are of concern, one of them being rates and helping contribute to a positive business case there. I think this is probably fairly obvious, but there's certainly customer benefits to the electrification of transportation, so obviously displacing diesel with clean electricity in the case of BC Hydro. Cost certainty is a huge help, so having rates that are predictable over time so you can make a plan for a transition. Maintenance, we're going to see reduced maintenance costs with electric versus combustion engines, so that's great. And obviously there's employee and public health benefits with air quality, noise, and those aren't necessarily quantifiable, so to speak. From a utility perspective and overall perspective, there's still challenges. One of them would be technology, and the other one would be cost, so that's a factor of time, really. Charging infrastructure is a big one we spend a lot of time talking about. How is the infrastructure going to work? Where is it going to be? Who's going to pay for the cost to install it? Who's going to maintain it? For a transit agency, it's going to be a change to their core business. For a utility, maybe not so much, but that's something to consider. And of course, there's interest in rate options, so some time of use rates. Sasha had also spoken about demand, which has been a big discussion. From BC Hydro's perspective, we are a regulated utility, so there's a regulatory process involved. We do have the British Columbia Utilities Commission that we have to report into. So a few things that I've been working on along with everyone at BC Hydro to help reduce some of those barriers in the electrification of transportation is we've developed a transportation sector team, so a team that's specifically dedicated to transportation only. We have a working group that's comprised of various members across BC Hydro, different business groups, and we also have an executive steering committee that will help us provide expertise, support, identify, and reduce barriers. So as we're entering into this space, and so rates would be one of those things, or infrastructure, we can bring that up with our executive steering committee to talk about how we can address that and how quickly we can address that. That's been a huge help. And one of the outcomes of having this working group and steering committee is that BC Hydro in August filed a rate application with the BC Utilities Commission to minimize rate impacts of electrification. I've got a bit of a model I'll take you through very quickly, but we have proposed a fleet electrification rate that will be of benefit to those electrifying. One of the other things that we often do is we try to identify process improvements to help expedite and make it easy for customers to do business with us. We know that sometimes the utility is not the easiest thing to navigate, not the easiest place to navigate, so that's why you have people like me and other of my peers in the room that are here to help make it easy to do business with us, help you understand what our process is, and also help us identify where we can improve our processes. Another part would be to educate and collaborate with organizations, customers, and industry, helping to identify opportunities and address barriers. So I have the fortunate opportunity of working with both of our transit agencies in the province, and you will see that we've partnered and talked about what the barriers are, what the challenges are, and we're able to navigate things together as opposed separately. And that just sums up the bottom there, that we partner with our customers in their strategy to transition to low-carbon electrification. The sooner that we can be having these conversations with our customers, with transit agencies, the better. Then we can inform them of our processes, what we can, what we can't do, what we can potentially change, what we can't change, and vice versa. The more we understand about what's a concern to transit agencies, the better we can serve you. Oh. Some of this information is sort of blocked out, so I apologize for that. But I just wanted to walk you through really quickly 2 of the electrification rates that we have proposed. And it really follows the sort of depot charging and en route charging model, if you would, for transit. So we have a time of use rate, which is really an overnight rate. So it would allow your buses or vehicles to charge overnight during our off-peak period, therefore bringing the cost of the demand right down. And then there's an energy-only rate or a demand transition rate. And that would be more for your en route scenario. So we're trying to minimize the demand impacts for when transit first starts off. So if you have an en route charger and right now you only have 1 or 2 buses on your system, you're only maybe passing through that charger once an hour. So you're setting that peak for 5 minutes once an hour. Once you start having 20 or 30 buses on that route, then that demand charge starts to level out because you've got buses passing through that charger maybe every couple of minutes. So that demand transition rate is really meant to help ramp up the electrification of transit, and then at some point it'll level off and we'll just end up on a regular rate. So I apologize that the slides don't look very well, but this is just a little bit more of a summary about that overnight charging and the energy-only rate, which, like we said, is filed with the British Columbia Utilities Commission. We have to go through a regulatory process, which we're probably just about to start in a couple of weeks. So it's not been finalized at this point. All it has been is proposed. And so we sort of have to go through a bit of a hearing process to justify those rates. But hopefully the next time we gather, we'll have some good news to share with regards to where we are at with the rates. Thank you.
That's great. And I think it's a general trend right now. Everywhere we go, we hear there's new hearing rate applications going in and new hearings around it. Toronto Hydro just had one, and everybody's waiting for the outcome of that. There's a whole number of them in the U.S. and obviously with BC Hydro. So with that, we're going to turn to John Roulette, Director of Energy Solutions at ENMAX, the voice from Alberta, as we were hoping to obtain a little bit more of a voice from the western side, given that we're here in Manitoba. And everything, I think, east of Manitoba, if you live in the east, you think everything is western. But in reality, if you're in Alberta, you know, Manitoba's pretty central, so we did want a Western voice, and thank you so much to John for coming out from ENMAX. We're really quite keen to hear about the new strategies that ENMAX is proposing.
Good morning, everyone. Happy to be here. It's like a classic joke from a movie right there. Left and right? Just big button at the top. Okay, here we go. And now for something completely different. So I'm, as mentioned, here from Alberta. I work for ENMAX. So we are effectively a vertically integrated utility in Alberta, but then things change. For those of you who don't know, I'm going to spend a little bit of time here just describing how the Alberta utility market works, because we are unique in Canada, and I'll do that by giving you a little introduction to ENMAX and who we are. Very busy slide. We won't go through the whole thing, but there will be a multiple choice test later. So see how many numbers you can remember. But very quickly, to give you an overview, as I say, vertically integrated, we participate in the generation market. We have 1,600 megawatts of generation, which ranges everything from 800 megawatt combined cycle gas plants all the way down to distributed solar on residential buildings that we are involved in. We are active in the wholesale market. We own and operate the wires distribution system for the city of Calgary, and we are the largest retailer of energy in the province. Now, within that, though, there's different pieces. In Alberta, the generation market, the wholesale market, and the retail market are what we refer to as deregulated. However, a better term is probably competitive, because there are still a lot of regulations and rules to follow, but it is a competitive market. In your energy market, you run your generator, you can sell long-term contracts, or you can take the hourly pool price, which changes every hour, so you get some variability there. As a user of energy, you can pick who you would like to purchase from. So there are different competitive offers out there. Everything from hey, I will pay market price, so I will pay you that hourly price in the wholesale market, plus perhaps a small retail fee, or things like 5 and even 10-year contracts where you lock in pricing. You can have on-peak, off-peak. There's any number of different things that occur. That, of course, is different than the transmission and distribution side of the industry, which are regulated. So within our company, within ENMAX, we have sort of those two pieces. The Chinese wall between the two, where we can't talk about what's going on the other side to maintain, the appropriate sort of relationship around competitiveness, things like that. So all of this introduces a very interesting dynamic when we talk about serving customers and emerging markets and new types of services. The other thing that we do, which I think is somewhat unique, is that through our power services business, which is also a competitive business, we actually take part with our customers behind their meter. We have a fairly sizable distributed solar business where we actually provide turnkey solar projects to our customers. So those are behind their meters, connected to their facilities. We design, install, finance, and provide O&M services for those kinds of systems. We are doing that now. It's very fledgling, but starting to do that with stationary storage solutions. So we're looking at that. We also do a fair bit of high voltage work. So customers who need, high voltage switchgear, or perhaps even substations, industrial scale substations and things. And all of that happens in our competitive side. Of course, on the regulated side, then we get into, I think more what you would typically see from your distribution company, wires and poles down the sides of streets, neighborhood transformers, the substations, and all of that equipment, which of course then comes with all sorts of rules with it in terms of what you're allowed to do on the regulated side. So I will flip to the next slide to talk a little bit about the strategy that we're looking at here around electric vehicles. I'm going to echo a few of the things that I think we heard this morning. We see this coming, but there's going to be some required changes to various business models to support the electrification of urban transportation and transit. That's changes from the utilities point of view, also from the transit operator point of view or the fleet point of view, and we're all trying to figure that out right now. Looking at it from our perspective, and this is, again, relatively new for us, sort of fledgling, we're trying to figure out what role we can best play, where we can best compete, and what kind of service we can offer to best move this market forward. Because, don't get me wrong here, we see this as an opportunity. In fact, I will argue, even with those within my company, that this is one of the biggest opportunities we have across all parts of our business, because it's shifting a fuel source, right? Generally, growth in the electricity industry at the moment, or historically, has been, well, if you build a new neighborhood, if you get more buildings, you get some more industry. And then there were guys over there running on liquid transportation fuels. And now we're starting to see that merge. So to me, that's actually pretty exciting, and we see big opportunity. The question being, where do we play? You can see up here, what we've kind of identified is the pieces in the middle of this. We don't see ourselves becoming experts in electric vehicles. There are people in the room who are experts at that, and we will hope continue to be. So we see ourselves playing differently. We see ourselves playing in that battery space, or the actual asset space, again, because we have synergies with our generation fleet. If there is a second life to battery storage, we feel that we could be very well positioned to value that and take advantage to that, as opposed to a transit authority who typically are not in the generation of storing energy and or producing energy. Charging infrastructure, we see that as something that could be right in our wheelhouse. I appreciate the comments earlier about who might be best suited to do that. I have a phrase that I use with customers all the time, is that, well, what's your day job? Our day job is to generate electricity, it's to transmit electricity, it's to handle the equipment that manages electricity. Most of my customers' day jobs is either to run a transit agency or perhaps a manufacturing facility. So it's not their job to become an expert in, say, rooftop solar. We can do that. They need to be experts in their day job. So there's sort of an alignment of tasks. And of course, the electricity piece, we are a generator, we're a retailer. We can tailor products and services to that. Just below is a little summary of where we see different services. So the engineering, there should be a comma there, my apologies. The engineering, procurement, and construction of electric vehicle infrastructure, capital investment programs. Right now, with our distributed solar product, over 90% of it is financed by us, typically on long-term agreements with our customers. 15 to 20 years is very common. We're willing to do that because of who we are. We're going to be around for a long time. We're not going anywhere. We think that may have application into the EV space as well. And then operation and maintenance services for the infrastructure. Again, likely not the vehicles themselves, but for that electrical infrastructure, the chargers, and all the pieces that come with it. Before I sort of move on and we can get into discussion, there is a big challenge here with sort of in the Alberta market, that competitive side and that regulated side. We heard about a couple of the rules, and we saw examples of an ask to the regulator to say, hey, can we do these things? And that's a challenge that we have in our company and in our jurisdiction, in that right now in Alberta, there is no mandate for a regulated distribution entity to get involved in this whatsoever. And in fact, there are no drivers for them to get involved. There's no sort of signal from government saying, please do this to reduce carbon from transportation, or to help municipalities, or to help transit. So there remains this question of, well, will that signal come? Because if it does, it changes the market, and it changes the landscape, and it changes where you may be able to make investment or who can make investment. And I would suggest that uncertainty at the moment may be working to slow things down. It's hard to say at the moment because it's all still very nascent. But we see that as a big challenge going forward. Is who will have the ability to do what, who is best suited to do it, who can do it in a most cost-effective way, all in the sort of drive to see more adoption and roll these things out. So all these things that we are struggling with. I will end very quickly because I see my time's up, just to show that we are actually trying to walk the talk within our own fleet. We have a very large fleet, which is captive to the City of Calgary effectively, because that's where we look after all the wires systems and the infrastructure. So we're actually in the middle of something, we call it our e-fleet pilot. It's effectively partnering with Navistar to get two sort of, I'll call them mid-range, sort of Class 6 vehicles, new vehicle platforms to the market into our fleet to test it out. That helps us deploy some charging across the city, which hopefully will have some synergy with other potential users like City of Calgary Municipal Fleet. So just something that we're ticking away at. I know today is about transit, but we sort of see the opportunity for synergy and sharing across networks and across platforms, and hopefully what we can learn here can also help us support our transit customers as we go forward. So with that, I'll leave it there and we can get to the panel discussion. Thank you.
So that was a great segue. And in fact, I think although we're here talking about transit, there's a reason we were so focused on standardization, interoperability. It's because everybody here, I think a lot of people here, certainly we do at QTRIC, think electrification of transit is just the segue. It's just the segue to coach and truck and delivery vehicle. And electric vehicles as personal automobiles, they're a bit tougher because you have to convince a household to buy that car. It's a household economic decision. But fleets and trucks and buses and coaches, if they can use the same infrastructure and have the same fuel provider, that's a much bigger win in the short term, at least for the public. And John, you've made a great introductory comment to our first question to the panel, and that is where you said, you don't have a signal in Alberta. You haven't gotten a signal from the regulator to say that you ought to be investing in these spaces. And in fact, about 4 years ago, we started a power providers working group in Ontario, and we called together Ontario Power Generation, a whole bunch of local distribution companies, Toronto Hydro, OPG, Hydro One, all of them. And the whole idea was from the Ministry of Energy in Ontario to figure out if the utilities could decide what they needed the regulator to do. And we had the regulator in the room, the Ontario Energy Board. And I remember one day when sort of the lawyer, she was very vehement about it, and she kind of slammed her fist on the table at a certain point, just frustrated and upset. And she goes, listen, tell us what you need to do and we will create the regulations, but we can't just create them from wind. We need a minister to tell us that that is actually what the regulator ought to be regulating. And right now, regulators in Canada typically need to keep electricity fair and cheap and available and essential. But very rarely, and in fact, I think nowhere in the country currently does the regulator say, and environmentally efficient and clean and oriented around zero emissions. But they've started to do that in California. And so that's the signal that you've referenced. And that leads us to our first question for the utilities. Should utilities in Canada have an electrification of transit and transportation strategy? Because almost none of them do. At the highest levels of decision making, there's no document that says this is the plan, this is what our role is going to be, and this is what investment we need and ministerial support we need in order to get to that target. Because right now, who's steering the ship? So that's the question, and we're going to start off, maybe John, on your end. Do utilities need, or ought they have a transit and transportation electrification strategy in Canada?
So I'll start by saying yes, I think they should. As I mentioned earlier, I think this is actually a big opportunity for growth in the electrical industry. I'll leave aside even the advantages to greenhouse gas, air pollution, all those sorts of things. Just if you're interested in your core business, here's a new market to go after. Here's something that can promote growth, that fits with what your traditional business was, if slightly different in nature. I think the big challenge with that is what we were talking about, though, on that regulated side. And depending on the market you're in, vertically integrated Crown Corp, very different than what we have in Alberta, and again, different than Ontario with, sort of the larger infrastructure and I think 62 LDC companies, municipally sort of driven LDCs, who each one has their own set of rules and constructs and everything else. From our perspective, we're looking at this and sort of saying, and in the Alberta context, we see it as an opportunity. Now, the signal to do that needs to be economic in that point. It's like, is this a business opportunity for us to serve our customers because our customers are going there? Why are the customers going there then becomes the question. California did this because they want low emissions from transportation. The government basically turned to the regulator and said, we want this, help the utilities get there. Frankly, that's what a regulator loves, because then they go, great, this took it out of my hands. Government said, do it. We'll keep it as fair and efficient as we can. Hey, utilities, come back with a plan and let's move ahead. Maybe an oversimplification, but bear with me. In Alberta, we don't have that, and because it's in a way separated, carbon emissions in our electricity system are handled, through effectively the Minister of the Environment on generation. The wires companies in the middle, the regulated distribution entities and transmission entities, all they do is move electrons. They actually don't have emissions, and they're not responsible for the emissions either on the generating end or the end use. Therefore, our regulator looks at that group and says, well, we really don't have a mandate to tell you to help somebody else reduce emissions, right? That has to happen. That happens on the generation side. Mm-hmm. It's a different place. So somewhere in that mix, in that sort of hot mess of stuff going on, is there the economic growth case that utilities should be interested in this market? I would argue yes. You're going to have to figure out, given the construct of your market and your regulatory regime and everything else, how you play in that. And then you get into, why is the customer going to do this? We're quite excited to work with Calgary Transit. We know they're looking at this. We want to help them along as we can. We are, wholly owned by the City of Calgary, so there's a great synergy there. But this has to make sense to them, and again, no one is coming to them and saying, hey, we'll give you, at the moment anyway, a lot of money to do this for, say, climate change purposes. Sure. It's more the business case. So
so we need a kind of political economic driving factor combined, and possibly what you've referred to also, John, is a reorganization potentially of the energy system and the energy market may be required if it is in fact the case that some of the delivers don't have the mandate and the action is occurring at another end of the spectrum. So we'll come back to that. And Kim, from your perspective as a Crown Corp utility, do we need transit electrification strategy?
I'm going to broaden that out a little bit to say, overall, I think we need to have an electrification strategy. So again, from a utility standpoint, we're going to stand back and look at where is our largest opportunity all over the province to reduce GHG emissions. Does that include transit? Does that include transportation? Absolutely. For us, it's a broader picture, and we're very fortunate in BC to have a lot of sentiment to reduce emissions. We've got different cities that have targets. We've got different organizations, you name it, that has targets. So we have the motivation. We have the energy. We're vertically integrated, so that'll allow us to do that. I think from a policy perspective, that's probably where we do need help, unlike California, where the government has dictated to the Utilities Commission what they want. Our current government is trying to make things a little bit more transparent, be a little bit less hands in telling the Utilities Commission what to do. So that's, I think, to some degree kind of slowed things up, but I think there's absolutely a sentiment to do the right thing. What we do need is a little bit more push from policy once that falls into place, and I hate to sort of take that Crown Corp stance, but if we were mandated to do more, we would absolutely be able to move things faster than we are doing currently.
Okay, so decision making still comes from the top, and at the end of the day, there's no way to get around it, although there may be more democratic ways of approaching the actual policy.
Yeah, I don't want to say to a degree there's nothing we can do to get around it. I think we can help inform. We can help inform our customers. We can help inform government what's going on, what will be helpful, but we still unfortunately have to let process play out, and we try to do what we can in the meantime to help fill that gap until we have something a little bit more overarching to I don't want to say force us in that direction.
Yeah, and they're interesting insights because you can see we've got NMAX and BC Hydro here. Well, we've got a lot of partners at QTRIC from the utility sector, from BC Hydro to Manitoba Hydro, Nova Scotia Power, a bunch of LDCs, OPG. A lot of folks did not want to be on the panel. And the companies really discussed the idea of being on the panel. And it's important that we have this kind of panel, but did not actually want to be on the panel. And the reason is simply because there isn't an internal coherent position to articulate publicly. And that is pretty indicative of where we are in 2019, if that's the case. And I think as Canadians, we have a lot of work to do, and our politicians at Ministries of Energy have a lot of work to do to give these signals.
Yeah, and I think we wanted to participate just in large part because it's a learning. We want to share what we've learned. We want to learn from others. We want to find out what everyone is doing. And if you're not willing to sort of speak out about the reality of where things are at and share your experiences with customers and vice versa, we're never really going to move forward. For a large part, California does set the precedent, so I think a lot of us sit back and watch and look to see what California does. They do a lot of great things. They don't necessarily do everything right out of the gate, so there's an opportunity for everybody to learn from that. So it's unfortunate that we're not necessarily the people out there leading, but we're coming in close behind, and we're happy to take that position and learn from it so that when we implement it, we can implement it well.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. And a voice from British Columbia, which I think it's fair to say is probably the last standing provincial jurisdiction outside of Quebec that aligns with federal climate action goals. And so that is indicative of also where we are in terms of what the utility can and ought to be doing. And Sasha, you work in California a lot with transit agencies and utilities trying to electrify entire fleets that are running around with like chickens with their heads cut off, trying to figure out how to do this in a very short period of time. So what is it? Do utilities need a transit electrification strategy?
Absolutely. And
yeah,
there we go. Absolutely. I think there's a need. California's taken some great leadership. Is everything perfect? No. And, through the ZEB task force that I sit on, we're having the discussions that need to happen. We have disjointed parties still. We have CARB setting regulation. We have the utilities doing their thing. We have the transit industry that's now burdened with a mandate that's unfunded, and they don't know how to achieve it. So we're all trying to align the pieces. I'll give California credit that they did develop a roadmap. It's working. At least it gives us a strategy. Rewind back some almost 10 years ago, I worked at the province of Ontario, and we were developing an electric vehicle charging infrastructure roadmap. And how far should the province of Ontario go into electrifying fleets? And here we are almost 10 years later, and not much has really happened since that work that I worked on even back then. So we're catching up. I think California's doing a good job. There's going to be a lot of lessons learned that emerge out of that, and we're quickly seeing those lessons. So stay tuned, but I think they're doing the right thing at least, and they've stuck their necks out, and everyone's watching very closely, and everyone in California knows that.
So with that, we are going to turn to questions from the audience, and we do have 2 microphones here, so if you have your question, line it up. But in rapid action fire and parliamentary rules of 60-second queries, one of the things we've experienced over the last few years, and certainly that we've alluded to, is most ministries of energy themselves don't have a transportation plan. So most transportation ministries don't have an energy plan. That's the case. We have 10 provinces. You would be hard-pressed to find one ministry of transportation in the country that has an energy transformation plan. You would be equally, if not more, hard-pressed to find one Ministry of Energy in this country that has a transportation electrification plan. And we have faced this in all provinces that QTRIG has operated in, where there is no coordinated transportation energy matrix plan. And that is about holding hands across mandated levels of government to transform this industry. So in 60 seconds, essentially, if it were the case that the ministries woke up tomorrow and ministers said, look, we shall have this plan, and here are the price signals, or rather here are the market signals or the environmental signals, thou shalt provide the fuel of the future. The question to you is, can utilities be the fuel providers of the future, and how quickly could that happen? If tomorrow the mandate were there and the signals were there, how quickly could our utilities displace petrochemical industries and being the fuel suppliers of the future for transportation? John?
I get to start, eh? Okay. Great answer I heard at a conference last week. It depends. To be honest, at a certain level, we see this as opportunity. We're not too concerned, particularly in terms of supplying the actual energy. Alberta's long on generation. More can be built. Like, we see that as fairly straightforward. Infrastructure is another issue, though. When and where that demand comes. We heard a number earlier that, hey, yeah, it might be 3 to 5 years to get you, the transit authority, what you need. That might be on the outside for our jurisdiction, but it, like I said, it depends. If you start turning transit barns into small industrial electrical consumers that require a new substation, et cetera, that's not an overnight process. Personally, I think it can be accommodated. I think it can be worked through. The big challenge, though, is that comes with very high upfront cost, which can be prohibitive depending on whose balance sheet it sits on and how those costs are distributed. And there's also the issue of, well, what are we asking for today versus what do we think we need in 5 or 10 years? You know, do you build it really big and hope it'll come? That's challenging. Do you start small, but then you're constantly trying to catch up? There's all of those issues that come into play, which are difficult to work through. So the overarching question is, we can do a lot of it. Like it, you know, it's going to take a bit of runway, but we'll get there. It's not an impossibility, but it's not a, hey, yeah, by the end of the year we can have, you know, the whole bus fleet electric and there won't be any growing pains. We're not there either.
Okay, so it might not be a 5-year solution strategy, it might be more like a 10-year transition strategy, if in fact the political mandate were there, which is the big question mark. Go ahead, John, the last comment?
No, I was just going to say yes. I mean, that's, you know, that's where it comes back to that. Well, it depends, right? What's the demand from the market? How many, how fast, where are they going to charge, what they're going to charge, and all of those things, there's a myriad of options in almost each of those categories that trying to figure that out is challenging.
Right, quite complex. So Kim?
Yeah, I would echo the exact same statement. I think we're well in a position to be the fuel provider of the future. We connect people every day, all day. That's what we do. This really shouldn't be any different. However, again, let's refer to depot versus en route. If you're doing en route charging, it's a higher charge in a denser population. Maybe the wires are a little bit more difficult to get to, or they're underground. There's civil work required. That can get quite complex. Or likewise, if you're converting an old bus barn into something that's electric and it's a 30 or 40 megawatt plant, I mean, that's like a small industrial facility that you're building. That doesn't happen overnight. There's engineering that's required. There's coordination of land and properties and rights of way that needs to be negotiated. So from a fuel perspective, we're also long on energy, so that's not a problem. It's just the actual physical infrastructure and wires piece that I think would be a little bit more time consuming.
So another kind of 5 to 10 year civil works transition, if in fact the mandate were there to start yesterday.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Okay. And Sasha, from your experience?
Yeah, I'll be the Kevin O'Leary in the room. Where's the money? You know, it's one thing to have the political mandate. I think we can move pretty quick on the actual engineering and all that stuff, but there's got to be the money behind it to support that kind of a mandate. It can be done. I mean, it's going to be very challenging, and again, we're gonna have resource constraints. There just isn't enough people to do all this work simultaneously. It might take a little bit longer than. I know we're all very enthusiastic, and everyone would like to move very quick, but the reality is there's so many electrical engineers. There's so many people that can work at once. So we're gonna have resource constraints again across the professional services industries for sure, and need to manage for that.
Okay, so it's going to cost something, and it's not a small amount of something. But we've heard this many times. I mean, the electrical infrastructure in Canada needs a massive upgrade anyhow. From left, right to center, there's a massive upgrade that's required. This is maybe just motivating that dialogue. John, last comment, then we'll turn to a question.
Yeah, and just to hit on that cost, like one of the big issues is the issue of stranded cost, right? We're already seeing that in some unique instances. And actually just last week, the Alberta regulator had a 3-day conference around DERs, distributed energy resources, but they included electric vehicles in that as well, sort of thinking, hey, this is a big trend coming. And that is something that's going to need to be figured out, because from the competitive private sector, if you're going to build a lot of infrastructure, you either need a customer to commit to it so that you know you're getting your return. The customer has to know they can commit to it. They can't change platforms in the middle of that, of paying off that infrastructure. Or if it's a regulated utility, if they build it and it doesn't come, or it changes, or we build 30-year infrastructure which changes, how do you account for that? Right?
Yeah, and people have
difficult.
talked about this already in Ontario, where money has gone out the door for DC fast chargers, in some cases backed by utility, and it is stranded. And so the question is, was that good taxpayer use dollars or not? And so we'll turn to Catalina Gallo from ABB. We've got questions, so I can ask you to answer in about 45 seconds each.
If a picture were 1,000 words, I think somebody asked me earlier, what does QTRIC do? And the image before me, in a time of fractious constitutional Canadian debates on energy transfers, having Alberta and BC together on stage is awesome. So thank you, Josipa, thank you, QTRIC. My question is, in view of the funding question that keeps coming up and up, don't you think it would be great that if we manifested a bold vision or strategy on electrification, that global financial markets would be interested in investing more?
Mm-hmm. Great. So a question on that financial innovation theme, is there not a possibility that new sources of investment capital would arise if in fact there were these strategies driving the creation of a marketplace? And we'll start with you, Sasha.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a role for the P3 market and a new financial market stepping in. As I kind of alluded to, there's just the municipalities can't shoulder the burden of this cost. So I think there is a role for the financial markets to step in. It's financial markets like infrastructure. It's predictable, the payback is pretty good, but on the municipal side, the issue then is, we can borrow less. We can borrow at a cheaper rate. So there's always that risk transfer that has to come in any P3 model, and the way you structure it, making sure the risk is anchored with the party best able to manage it. But I do think you're going to see that interest. I think, there's a lot of business cases, at least, people are even coming to talk to me that, we should approach transit agencies and talk about renewables and how we can save them some money, and this will pay for itself. And it all sounds great in theory, but I think you're going to see a lot of innovative solutions emerging. I agree with you.
And certainly one of the worries that we've heard about is if there isn't financial innovation and investment, then the ratepayer is going to have to carry this. And that means my electricity bill for my 500 square foot Soviet-style condo is going to be $5,000, right? And the ratepayer cannot carry the cost. So potentially investment from foreign or global investment sources. Kim, is that a possibility?
I think it's a possibility. I think that's what's being weighed out right now. Who is best suited to serve that? And that's a question that hasn't quite been answered at this point in time. And I think from a utility perspective, our utility perspective, I think to a degree, we're sort of indifferent about who we connect to. If we, so we're happy to serve whoever we serve. We're still going to be a partner. We're still going to be a part of the game. But yeah, I think there's opportunity there. Okay.
New sources of income and revenue?
Yeah. I think it comes down to the market signal and the risk. It was already touched on. I don't think we'll have any trouble getting capital for this if there's the right sort of vision of a market and the use case. Look at renewables as a parallel, I think. If you put in policy that had a target for renewables, which created a market of a certain size, really nice when they came with 20-year government-backed contracts. Capital flooded in from all over the world floods into those jurisdictions, and I mean floods. But that's because the risk there is very, very low, and they hunt it. If you need the capital to come in, it's that question of risk. I think it'll show up once people either get comfortable with that market, or if there's the policy and the rules that basically dictate this market is going to exist.
Fantastic. And I'm going to, last comment, and then I'm sorry, Doug, we've run out of time, so I'm going to ask you to hold on to your question and ask the panel afterward at the reception.
And I stood here so long.
I'm so sorry. Well,
we talk too much.
I'll just add, from my perspective, when I was at the province, I was structuring P3 deals with municipalities. And one of the caveats here is that municipalities are going to have to open their minds to a different type of partnership. Municipalities are slow to make those kind of rash decisions because councils are thinking of 4-year terms. They're not thinking 30 years. So to get them to bind them to a 30-year contract, very difficult. And at my time during Infrastructure Ontario, we were very slow to get municipalities to move on P3 projects. So that appetite has to be there. There's some cities that are sophisticated, but others need a lot of convincing. And the issue then is once they understand what the total life cycle cost is of the asset, because many municipalities work in capital costs, they're not really thinking about the O&M that comes with it. And once you put that true, total cost of ownership number out there, they get scared. So we need a mindset in how a mindset shift in how municipalities operate to be able to push this really forward.
Yeah, and
So
we've heard
I'll
that a lot, Sasha, as we've moved into, and we'll talk about it a lot more in the upcoming panels, innovative finance P3 models around transit electrification, not classic ones, but really innovative ones that our whole system plays. Maybe the utility is actually part of that P3. And one of the things we've heard is, look, there's some cities in Canada that legally will never take on debt. They will never take on debt, they'll never take on finance, and so you're stopped right at the door. There is not even a dialogue to be had. And if we've understood what our panelists have said here today, that ultimately in the utility sector and electricity sector, we need ministerial mandates and decisions, and maybe that is ideological, but if we do believe that climate change is nonpartisan, then perhaps actually acting and creating the regulatory environment, or at least the market signals for electrification at the utility level actually just becomes as standard a business as building wires and posts to carry those wires and distribution and transmission equipment. So with that, we're leading right into the future of transit electrification. I'd like to thank our panelists here at the utility side of the equation. And next year, back here, same time, same place, I suspect we'll have a fuller panel of utilities willing to dive deeper into the dark recesses of what the future of electrification in the energy sector will look like in Canada. Thank you to our panel.